Good evening, and it's wonderful to welcome you to Words of My Perfect Teacher. And this evening, we are working with chapters 5 and 6. 5 is a super short but powerful chapter, page and a half. And then we have a much longer chapter about the teacher. So again, we're working with this book, Words of My Perfect Teacher. This is the revised edition, which I will use this evening. I had been working with the older one, very similar, but I did notice for this evening, there were a few footnotes that were slightly different. So I think that there were some that were added. And so again, always welcoming everybody. And the whole goal is that this is a very well-known book, and Words of My Perfect Teacher by Patrul Rinpoche is read by many, many people. And we are just finishing up part 1. And when we finish this part 1, then we will, for the beginning of the year, go to part 2. And what's interesting about part 2 is for those doing the Longqing Ning Nundra practice, part 2 is called the extraordinary or inner preliminaries. So I believe that we'll feel very much at home. And also we will get some illumination about some of the practices that we are doing with the preliminaries. And so this evening, we're again looking at chapter 5 and 6. We could combine them because 5 is just so short and short and powerful. And the main thing to know for chapter 5, which is called The Benefits of Liberation. And I'm going to actually try to use some of the page numbers so that we can keep up for those who like following the book. For those who don't, it's fine, to listen. And so chapter 5 talks about the benefits of liberation. And basically the benefit of liberation is freedom from suffering. And that's something that we all are very much in touch with. What is suffering, the cause, the release, and liberation is the benefit. And in chapter 5, Patrul Rinpoche encourages Buddhahood as one's own soul aim. And it reminds me that Asa Rinpoche would always say to look to achieve Buddhahood in one lifetime. And then he would say, do you believe you can become a Buddha in one lifetime? So we want to make that our aim. However, Patrul Rinpoche also lists that the freedom from suffering and the benefit of liberation may take place as what's called a Shravaka, sometimes called a hearer or a disciple of the Buddha, and sometimes referred to as an Arahat, and also a Prateka Buddha. And it's interesting about a Prateka Buddha is somebody who actually becomes a Buddha without a teacher. And in one source, it says that they understand the interdependence, and that is one way, and contemplate it. And then the other is that they have a lot of incredible karma, and they do become enlightened in this lifetime without a teacher. So that's a Prateka Buddha. And in one place I heard that they didn't teach, but in another place I did hear that they taught exactly what they know. So that's kind of good to know. So the practices for liberation that Patrul Rinpoche outlines is very simple. As we know, simple is not always easy. But the practices include raising bodhicitta, remaining free of conceptualization during meditation, and then closing with dedication. So this is a short practice that he gives for chapter 5 and for liberation. And he also mentions to make the mind pliable. And this is something that's talked about in other traditions and also is something important to know. And I think we all know that if we have a stubborn mind and get stuck with stubbornness, it's very hard to learn. So his way of making the mind pliable is with the 4 thoughts. And of course, we do the 4 thoughts in the Longqing Ningtig Nunzhou and also in many other practices. And just as a refresher, that is impermanence, knowing of suffering, knowing of karma, and also recognizing the preciousness of our human birth. So we do the 4 thoughts all the time. And Patrul Rinpoche says that's what makes the mind pliable. So when we contemplate impermanence, certainly it's hard to hold on to things. When we contemplate suffering and its causes, and of course, letting go being a way out of suffering, again, making the mind pliable. And then karma, realizing that there's the interdependence. And of course, that also can make the mind pliable. And then really realizing the precious human birth. You know, even if we think we're having a bad day, we still have the precious human birth. So these are ways of making the mind pliable. And then he says also it's important to remain in a peaceful and cool state. And this word cool is really referred to as the cooling of the passions, the cooling of all of our inner turmoil. So those are ways to towards liberation. So we start for chapter 6 on page 137, if you're following. And this is pretty interesting because it's all about the spiritual teacher. And in some regards, there's just some incredibly beautiful, direct ways to relate to choose, and to follow, and to emulate a spiritual teacher. And that's what Patrul Rinpoche calls the 3 phases of following. The first is to examine the teacher. And the Dalai Lama says to examine the teacher for 12 years before you choose. I don't know if we all have 12 years, but it's one of the important points. And then the following of the teacher, and then the emulating of the teacher's realization and actions. So, you know, in one way, in Western culture, you know, we're in a democracy, we're in a culture that looks towards egalitarianism. We, at the same time, study with teachers, professors, we apprentice, we become, we are mentors, we have been mentored, and, you know, some people are interns. So we have different ways that we do learn in our culture. Some of the ways of learning in the with a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, we don't have in our culture. So that brings to mind, first of all, some learning, but it also brings to mind a way that we also need to be aware within our own integrity, the integrity of the teacher. And so there is some cross-cultural understanding, communication, and so maybe figuring it out as well. So page 137 again is talking about the 3 phases of the spiritual teacher. And then on page 138. There is a reason for choosing a really good teacher. Patrul Rinpoche includes some really poignant paragraphs, and the first one is an indented paragraph on the top of page 138, and it says, just as the trunk of an ordinary tree lying in the forest of the Malay Mountains absorbs the perfume of sandal from the moist leaves and branches, so that's from a sandalwood tree, so you come to resemble whomever you follow. So this is a very, this parable is used quite a lot. It's used for not only following a teacher, but who we're friends with, our environment, and coworkers, that whoever one chooses to mingle with, we take that on. We take that on. So the choice of a very good teacher is like the beautiful sandalwood scents and being permeated. And then we go down to some of the qualities of the teacher. And Patrul Rinpoche warns, even in his time, he says, as times have degenerated, nowadays it is difficult to find a teacher who has every one of the qualities described in the precious tantras. However, it is indispensable that the teacher we follow should possess at least the following qualities. So this is important as we're making our choices and as we're contemplating who our teacher is or who it will be. So they use a lot of the word he, so we'll have to use he or she. Should be pure, never having contravened any of the commitments or prohibitions related to the 3 types of vows. The external vow of the pratimoksha, those are the monk's rules, the inner vows of the bodhisattva, or the secret vows of the secret mantrayana. He or she should be learned and not lacking in knowledge of the tantras, sutras, and sastras towards the vast multitude of beings. His or her heart should be so suffused with compassion that he or she loves each one like his or her only child. He or she should be well versed in ritual practices outwardly of the Tripitaka and inwardly of the 4 sections of Tantra. By putting into practice the meaning of the teachings, he or she should have actualized in him or herself all of the extraordinary achievements of riddance, meaning getting rid of blockages, and to have realization. He or she should be generous, language should be pleasant, should teach each individual according to that person's needs, and should act in conformity with what he or she teaches. And these 4 ways of attracting beings enable him or her to gather fortunate disciples around. And so it said all of the qualities complete according to purest Dharma are hard to find in these decadent times. But trust the teacher who, based on pure observance of the 3 vows, is steeped in learning, great compassion, skilled in the rites of the infinite pitakas and tantras, rich in the fruit and the immaculate wisdom that comes through riddance and realization, drawn by the brilliant flower of the 4 attractive qualities. Fortunate disciples will gather like bees to follow. So it's actually quite nice that these are laid out, that we want to follow somebody who is learned, who embodies, and also someone who is acting and communicating in our best interest. So very, very important. There is a part of the of this text that talks about teachers not to follow, but we'll stick with those that we want to follow. And then we move on to page, pardon me, 139. And this one goes a little bit further, starting with the indentation in the middle of 139. The extraordinary teacher who gives the pith instructions has received empowerments, kept the Samayas, which are the commitments, and is peaceful, has mastered the meaning of the ground, path, and result tantras, has all the signs of approach and accomplishment, and is freed by realization, has limitless compassion and cares only for others, has few activities and thinks only resolutely of the Dharma, is weary of the world and leads others to feel the same, is expert in methods, and has the blessings of the lineage. Follows such a teacher, and accomplishment comes swiftly. There's a lot of emphasis in this chapter that the way that we follow the teacher brings swifter realization to us. So that is one of the reasons it's so heavily emphasized. Okay, you can read on your page 139 who not to follow. And then we'll go on to the bottom of page 141 as we continue on this topic. And it says that after examining him or her carefully, making an unmistaken assessment from the moment you find that a teacher has all of the positive qualities mentioned, you should never cease to consider him or her to be the Buddha in person. And we have a little note here, the little 995. And if we go back into our notes, which there's some really good notes in the back here. So we go back to note 95. And that's kind of interesting because what that means, and I actually looked this up, is that they went to, I think I mentioned the last time, there's a book called Guide to Words of My Perfect Teacher. And so those were in here is called notes because the author took notes listening to Patrul Rinpoche. So note 95 says, it specifies that to see one's spiritual teacher as a Buddha, one needs to feel, one, that he is the Buddha in person in the absolute and relative sense. Two, that all of his actions, be they spiritual or worldly, are those of a Buddha. That his kindness towards one exceeds that of the Buddhas. That he embodies the greatest of all refuge. And that if knowing this, one prays to him or her without relying on any other aid on the path, one will develop the wisdom of realization. So this is what we do not have in our culture. And it is a pretty interesting, in one way you might say addition. In another way, one might say, how does that work? So we will have, when we turn off our video, we always have our questions and answers, and there may be some interesting discussion. But this is something that is talked about, and it's talked about even to this day. in some ways, it could be really comforting and make us feel quite light to know that the person who is transmitting the Dharma, as we are all Buddhas, is also a Buddha, and to feel connected in that way. In another way, if something comes up, or that person who did manifest in a beautiful way somehow did something ethically, or maybe mistreated or something like that, and then in our culture we address it. And so that is something important to recognize, is and to look into, what do we do in our culture? And of course, if there was ever anything, a real violation, there are Western teachers who have a group that can be contacted, and there's a lot of help and guidance with that. So, but in the meantime, finding an amazing teacher and following and emulating an amazing teacher, and to think that that brings one closer to enlightenment. And it's very interesting. Asam Rinpoche always says that we all rise up in one mandala. And so the attention and the interconnectedness with the teacher within Tibetan Buddhism is really quite profound. Again, it's not quite like a mentorship. It's not quite like an apprenticeship. It's not quite like a professor. It's something a little bit deeper. And as we read in the book, Marvelous Garland of Rare Gems, there was always the student who was studying with the teacher and then receiving the transmissions, like one vessel going into another. And that's also mentioned in here. Okay, so we have that from page 141, and with our note 95. And then, let's see here. We go on to page 142. So it says, the teacher with infinite qualities complete is the wisdom and compassion of all Buddhas. So within Tibetan Buddhism, the teacher is looked upon as somebody who is able to teach us. So there is a great deal of reverence around the teacher, because the Buddha, the Shakyamuni Buddha, is not here. But a teacher who is carrying forth those teachings is. So appearing in human form for being's sake, he or she is the unequaled source of all accomplishments. So this chapter has a lot to do with faith and the kind of surrender to the teacher with this pliable mind. And again, this is where one has to really be astute as to who one is choosing as one's teacher. And then we can move on to page 143, where it becomes following the teacher. So we've chosen the teacher, and then it becomes that we are going to be following a teacher. And let's see here. So at the top of page 143, it also says, he or she is the great ship carrying us beyond the seas of samsaric existence. So again, that is great emphasis on the teacher. So following the teacher. And then we go to page 144. And it says, as the sick man or woman relies on his doctor, the traveler on his escort, the frightened man on his companion, merchants on their captain, passengers on their ferryman. If birth, death, and negative emotions are the enemies you fear, entrust yourself to a teacher. So again, it shows how important a teacher is within Tibetan Buddhism. Actually, I would say all of Buddhism. And so then from page 144 to 149 is that, and this is just something I reviewed because it's Words of My Perfect Teacher review. All of this, it's important to read from 144 to 149. It's ways that we would need to look at the time and the place and the circumstances of this book, and that a lot of the disciples would be in a monastery or an encampment, because there are a lot of, weren't necessarily monasteries, but encampments. And we've read about that, where they would be spending time for a summer, a winter, and so forth. And that we want to consider the time, the place, the culture, and really decipher for for us, what is following a teacher, and to really assess the dharmic benefit and to parse that out. So there are a lot of descriptions in here, very in-depth descriptions of following a teacher. I did not delineate them for our time together, because the conversation would go well past our time. But I think that it's important to read and it's important to understand, because like I said, we have mentors, we have apprentices, we have interns, we have professors, we have people working in medicine, music, arts, and different ways that we engage in learning, but we do not have the exact description of a teacher within Tibetan Buddhism. And at the same time, it's very much a part of the practice. So I leave that as an open source of discovery and perhaps further conversation during our time together. But in general, what we do want is a qualified teacher. They're aware of the rules of their tradition, the guidelines, their responsibilities towards students, to guide, to give pertinent teachings, spiritual advice. And we in turn, and this is very important, very highly emphasize that we in turn give respect and reverence. So there is a great deal of respect and reverence, and it's actually quite nice, that we value the teacher and we show that. And we hold our own integrity and we hold the teacher's integrity. And if anything doesn't seem right, we address it. Again, this is a cross-cultural situation and misunderstandings can arise. So on page 145 is the best way, a short sentence of all the sentences, that the best way to serve a teacher is through practice. And this has been said actually over and over again. So there are many ways to serve, but one's practice is a great offering to the teacher. And it's a great respect to the teacher because it means all that they've done and given is being put into practice. And then we go to something very beautiful, actually. On page 149, we go to that third step, which is emulating the teacher's realization and actions. And it's really quite lovely that one does study with the teacher of their choice so that they too can be like that. And, I've certainly seen that. I've seen over time, students studying with different teachers, and then they step into the role. It's very beautiful. It's just beautiful. So on page 149, there is a paragraph kind of toward the end where it says, like a swan swimming on a perfect lake, or a bee tasting the nectar of flowers, without ever complaining, but always receptive to him or her. Always wait upon your teacher with exemplary conduct. Through such devotion, you will experience all of his or her qualities. And again, it's like when Azam Rinpoche says, we all rise up in one mandala. So something happens with very great teachers where the positive qualities are transmitted. And again, it comes back to the sandalwood tree, right? That all becomes suffused in the sandalwood scent. So we have that on page 149. And then on page 151, on the last paragraph, it kind of concludes. It says, in the first place, you should take care to check the teacher. This means that before becoming committed to him or her through empowerments and teachings, you should examine with care. Should you find that he or she has all the characteristics of a teacher, then follow him or her. If some of them are lacking, don't follow. But from the moment you start to follow him or her, learn to have faith in him or her and see them with pure perception, thinking only of his virtues and seeing whatever he does as positive. Looking for flaws will only bring inconceivable ills. It's very interesting to, there are a lot of teachings about the noticing of even other people, noticing more of the positive qualities rather than being critical. At the same time, this is where, which is why these other pages, 144 to 149, is that when we do see mistakes within our culture, we do address it. But it's kind of nice to also see here that a way of looking is more toward the positive qualities rather than, maybe, how they, how they comb their hair, put on a shirt or what color they're wearing, all of that becomes inconsequential, but looking more towards the positive qualities. And I can actually say for myself, when I look more at people's positive qualities, I think it's a lot more uplifting. It doesn't mean we're ignorant. It just means that we're able to keep our attention, uplifted. It's good for us, and it's good for the other people too, because we're reflecting the positive back rather than the critical. So let's see here. We've talked about that already. So then on page 152, and I'm following all the notes I prepared for you. Our last paragraph there says, generally speaking, the teacher we meet is determined by the purity or impurity of our perceptions and the power of our past actions. So whatever sort of person he or she may be, never cease to consider as a real Buddha, the teacher through whose kindness you received the Dharma and personal guidance. For without the right conditions created by your past actions, you would never have had the good fortune of meeting an excellent teacher. And, this is so important because many of us have met incredible teachers, really incredible teachers. And not everybody does. So it's important to value that, even if you've met for a short time or you took one teaching, we have all met really incredible teachers. And it says, and this is where it gets a little bit interesting. It says, moreover, if your perceptions were impure, you could even meet the Buddha in person and still be unable to see the qualities that he had. So then this comes back to our own perception. So the teacher whom you have met by the power of your past actions and whose kindness you have received is the most important of all. And this is stated pretty much over and over again, because that's the one who's going to transmit the Dharma. That's the one that we are able to hear. And I think I mentioned a number of, maybe even a year ago, that one's teacher is the one we can hear. It might not be the most famous, it might not be the most popular, but it's the one that we hear. And let's see here. And it just says, to put into practice what the teacher advises. It says the final phase, emulating the teacher's realization and actions. This is kind of top middle of page 153. Consists in carefully examining the way he behaves, doing exactly what he does. And as the saying goes, every action is an imitation. He who imitates the best acts the best. It could be said that the practice of Dharma is to imitate the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the past. As the disciple is learning to be like his teacher, he will need to assimilate truly the latter's realization and way of behaving. The disciple should be like satsa, the little clay molds. Satsa from the mold of the teacher, just as the satsa faithfully reproduces all the patterns engraved in the mold. In the same way, the disciple should make sure he or she acquires qualities identical with, or at least very close to, whatever qualities the teacher has. Anyone who first examines the teacher skillfully, then follows him skillfully, and finally emulates his realization and actions skillfully, will always be on the authentic path, come what may. And then there's a very succinct paragraph just concluding what we just read. In the beginning, skillfully examine the teacher. In the middle, skillfully follow him. In the end, skillfully emulate his realization and action. A disciple who does that is on the authentic path. Okay, and let's see. We're going to skip a few pages here. There's some stories. There's a lot of stories about disciples following teachers, and they're really quite nice to read about. I'm not going to review those right now, but in terms of reading, it certainly is of interest to read about the disciples such as Milarepa, Marpa, and so forth. But at the top of page 166, it concludes, Inexpressible multitudes of Buddhas have already come, but their compassion has not been enough to save us. We are still in the ocean of suffering of samsara. Inconceivable numbers of great teachers have appeared since ancient times, but we have not had the good fortune to enjoy their compassionate care or even to meet them. These days, the teachings of the Buddhas are coming to an end, and that's a prediction, by the way, in the Kali Yuga. The 5 degenerations are more and more evident, and although we have obtained human life, we are totally in the clutches of our negative actions and confused about what to do and what not to do. As we wander like a blind person, alone on an empty plain, our spiritual friends, the supreme teachers, think of us with their boundless compassion, and according to the needs of each of us, appears in human form. Although in their realization, they are Buddhas, in their actions, they are attuned to how we are. With their skillful means, they accept us as disciples, introduce us to the supreme, authentic Dharma, open our eyes to what we should do, what we should not do, and unerringly point out the best path to liberation and omniscience. In truth, they are no different from Buddha himself, but compared to the Buddha, their kindness and caring for us is even greater. Always try, therefore, to follow your teacher in the right way with the 3 kinds of faith. And then there's the small paragraph. I have met a sublime teacher, but let myself down by my negative behavior. I found the best path, but I wander on precipitous byways. Bless me and all of those of bad character like me, that our minds may be tamed by the Dharma. So this concludes, before we begin our, where we turn off our video and we begin our conversation. But this chapter 6 is truly important to understand in our practice of Tibetan Buddhism. And as we find our way, as Buddhism has moved from the east to the west and globally, to really have a good look, to appreciate the role of the teacher, and also to see the ways cross-culturally that will take place. So thank you. And I also look forward to our next meetings, which will be starting on, again, the second half of the book, which will be the preliminary practice that we are doing for our Longqing Ningting Minzhou. And it will show us a path defined by Patrul Rinpoche and the Longqing Ningting lineage of practices for our liberation and our omniscience. So thank you all.